If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Sharing it with your friends and family helps spread knowledge. And when we help others grow, we grow too. Thank you so much for listening. Let's dive into the podcast. The Christmas Eve Fire and Vanishing Children. The night started like any other Christmas Eve. George and Jenny Sodder tucked their children into bed. The house filled with excitement for Christmas morning. But at 1:30 a.m., Jenny woke to the smell of smoke. The house was burning. George rushed outside to move his truck closer to the house. He planned to climb onto the roof and reach the upstairs windows where 5 of his children slept. But his truck wouldn't start. The engine that had worked perfectly hours before was completely dead. He ran to get his ladder from its usual spot. It was gone. The family searched frantically in the orange glow of the flames, but the ladder had vanished without explanation. George tried the water faucets to fight the fire himself. Nothing came out. The pipes that had worked fine all winter were bone dry. Every tool that could save his children had mysteriously failed at the exact moment he needed them most. The fire spread with frightening speed. George and Jenny managed to get 4 children out of the house. Plus their oldest son, who lived nearby, rushed over. But upstairs, 5 children remained trapped. Maurice, 14. Martha, 12. Louis, 9. Jenny, 8. Betty, 5. The parents screamed their names into the roaring flames. No sounds came back. Someone called the fire department at 2:30 a.m., but the trucks never came. Hours passed as the family watched their home burn to ash. The fire department finally arrived at 8 a.m., long after the flames had died out. They claimed they couldn't find the house, despite George having lived there for 16 years. The fire chief walked through the smoking ruins. He poked at the debris with a stick for less than 2 hours. Then he made a shocking announcement. The fire burned so hot that it completely destroyed the bodies, he said. There's nothing left to find. But George knew better. He had worked with coal and fire his whole life. He knew that this kind of house fire could never burn hot enough to turn human bones to ash. It would take temperatures of over 3,000 degrees. Their fire had lasted maybe 4 hours. The basement showed the truth. Family items lay scattered but recognizable. Appliances sat twisted but intact. If the fire couldn't completely destroy a washing machine, how could it erase 5 children without leaving a single trace? George stared at the cold ashes where his children should have been. In his gut, he felt a terrible certainty growing. This was no accident. Someone had taken his children. The search for answers was just beginning. The missing bodies and suspicious circumstances. The flames died down by dawn, but George Sodder's nightmare was just beginning. As he stood in the cold morning air, staring at the smoking remains of his home, the pieces of a darker puzzle started falling into place. The first shock came when he reached for the telephone. The line was dead. Someone had cut the phone wire clean through during the night. George's hands shook as he examined the severed cable hanging from the pole outside his home. Next, he searched desperately for his ladder. It always sat against the side of the house, ready for roof repairs. But on the night he needed it most, the ladder had vanished without a trace. George remembered placing it there just days before Christmas. The water pump told another troubling story. George had checked it himself before bed on Christmas Eve. It worked perfectly. Yet, when the fire started, not a single drop of water would flow. The pump had mysteriously failed at the worst possible moment. These were not accidents. Someone had planned this carefully. As news of the fire spread, neighbors began sharing strange details they had kept quiet. Mrs. Jennings from down the road admitted she saw a man watching the Sodder house earlier that evening. He stood motionless in the shadows, studying the windows and doors like he was mapping the place. Another neighbor heard a loud crash against the roof around midnight, just before the fire broke out. It sounded like someone had thrown a heavy object. Then came the smell of gasoline mixing with the burning wood. The fire chief arrived hours too late. He barely glanced at the scene before declaring it an electrical accident. No investigation, no questions about the cut phone lines or missing ladder. Case closed. But George knew better. He had worked with electricity his whole life. This was no accident. The strangest detail came last. Where 5 children had slept, the searchers found absolutely nothing. No bones, no teeth, no buttons or belt buckles. Even the family dog had escaped the flames, but somehow 5 human beings had vanished completely. House fires leave traces. Bodies leave remains. Yet the spot where Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty should have been contained only ash and silence. George gathered his surviving family close. Someone had taken his children. He could feel it in his bones. The question that would haunt him forever whispered through the winter air. Where were they now? The family's lifelong quest and public appeals. The fire was out, but George and Jenny Sodder refused to let their children's memory fade into ash. They made a choice that would define the rest of their lives. Instead of accepting what officials told them, they decided to fight back with everything they had. George sold his trucking business. The money went towards something that had never been done before in their small town. Along Route 16, a massive billboard rose from the ground. 5 young faces stared out at passing drivers. The words beneath were simple but powerful. Our children are not dead. They were kidnapped. A phone number sat at the bottom. So did an offer that grew larger each year. First, $1,000, then $5,000. Finally, $10,000 for information leading to their children. The billboard became famous across West Virginia. Travelers stopped their cars to stare. Newspapers wrote stories. Radio stations talked about the missing Sodder children during evening broadcasts. Letters began arriving at the Sodder house. Some came from kind strangers offering prayers. Others carried darker messages. One letter contained a photograph of a young man who looked remarkably like Louis, their oldest missing son. The photo was taken in a city hundreds of miles away. Jenny kept every letter in a wooden box. She read them over and over, searching for clues that might lead somewhere real. Phone calls came at all hours. A woman in Florida claimed she saw Maurice and Martha at a department store. A truck driver swore he spotted Betty at a gas station in South Carolina. Each tip sent George racing across state lines, chasing shadows that always disappeared when he arrived. The family never celebrated Christmas again. December 24th became a day of remembrance and renewed searching. George would stand in his yard, looking up at Jenny's room where the fire had started, still asking the same questions. Their neighbors watched the Sodders grow old while carrying this weight. Some whispered that the family should move on. Others admired their determination. Children in town grew up knowing the story, pointing at the billboard whenever their parents drove past. Jenny developed a ritual. Every morning, she would walk to her mailbox, hoping for the letter that would change everything. George kept his truck ready, gas tank full, prepared to drive anywhere at a moment's notice. The billboard stood for decades, weathering storms and seasons. The faces of Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty watched over a generation of travelers. Their story became part of local folklore, whispered around campfires, and discussed in coffee shops. Years turned into decades, but the Sodders never stopped believing their children were alive somewhere, waiting to come home. Theories of abduction and Mafia involvement. The weeks following the fire brought whispers that grew louder with each passing day. Neighbors began to recall strange details they had pushed aside. George Sodder's heated arguments about Mussolini at the local store suddenly seemed more dangerous than passionate. George had never hidden his feelings. He spoke openly against fascism, criticizing Italy's government and those who supported it. In a small West Virginia community, where many Italian families kept quiet about politics, George's voice carried far. Some admired his courage. Others saw it as reckless. The threats had started months before the fire. A man approached George near his trucking business, warning him about his big mouth. The stranger's words were clear. Keep talking, and George would pay the price. His house would burn, and his children would be taken where he could never find them. George had laughed it off then. Now, standing in the ashes of his home, those words felt like ice in his veins. Local investigators discovered connections that made their blood run cold. The insurance salesman who had visited George weeks before the fire was linked to known criminal figures. The man had pointed to the fuse box, mentioning how easily old wiring could spark. When George refused to buy additional coverage, the salesman's smile had turned cold. Phone calls poured in from across several states. A woman in Charleston claimed she saw 5 children matching the Sodder descriptions at a roadside diner. The children appeared scared, accompanied by 2 men who watched their every move. When she tried to speak to them, the men quickly led them away. Another witness came forward with an even more disturbing account. He had seen a large truck speeding away from the Sodder property in the early hours of December 25th. The driver looked Italian, he said, and something was covered in the truck bed. The FBI received an anonymous letter months later. The writer claimed knowledge of the children's location, stating they were alive and being held by people connected to organized crime. The letter demanded money for more information. When agents tried to trace it, the trail went cold. George hired private investigators who confirmed his worst fears. They found evidence of a wider conspiracy involving local officials who had deliberately hampered the search. Fire equipment had been mysteriously delayed. Key witnesses had been discouraged from speaking to authorities. The community split into camps. Some believed George's enemies had made good on their threats. Others whispered that perhaps the family knew more than they admitted. Official investigations and enduring uncertainty. When the FBI finally stepped into the Sodder case, George and Jenny felt a spark of hope. Federal agents meant resources. They meant expertise beyond what local police could offer. They meant someone would finally find the truth about their missing children. The agents arrived with clipboards and cameras. They measured. They photographed. They interviewed dozens of witnesses again. For weeks, black cars sat in the Sodder driveway as investigators combed through every detail of that terrible Christmas Eve. State authorities joined the effort. Fire experts from Charleston examined the scene once more. They brought equipment the local fire department never had. They tested soil samples from where the house once stood. They searched for any trace of the children. But something strange happened. The more officials investigated, the less they seemed to find. Each report raised more questions than it answered. The FBI files grew thick with witness statements that contradicted each other. Some people claimed they saw the children after the fire. Others swore they heard screams that night. The federal investigators hit walls everywhere they turned. The original fire scene had been disturbed. Evidence had been moved or lost. Key witnesses changed their stories when questioned again. Physical proof that might have solved everything had vanished or been destroyed years earlier. Local police records were incomplete. Some reports had gone missing. Others contained information that made no sense when compared to witness accounts. The fire chief who first declared the children dead had retired and moved away. He refused to speak with federal agents. George Sodder watched the investigation with growing frustration. Agents would promise updates that never came. Phone calls went unreturned. Meetings were canceled without explanation. The family felt like they were being pushed away from their own case. After 18 months of federal involvement, the case file was quietly closed. No conclusions, no explanations, just a thick folder marked unsolved that disappeared into government archives. The official silence felt like another betrayal. George had expected answers from the most powerful law enforcement agencies in the country. Instead, he got more mysteries. Why had the investigation stopped so suddenly? What had the agents really found? State authorities also stepped back. They cited lack of evidence and dead ends. The case was too old, they said. Too many crucial details had been lost to time. But George knew something else was happening. Witnesses were afraid to talk. Officials acted nervous when pressed for details. Someone wanted this case to stay buried. The endless investigations had produced mountains of paperwork, but zero justice. The Sodder children remained ghosts, caught between official indifference and their parents' desperate love. The mystery today, legacy, and continued search. Sylvia Sodder Paxton sits in her living room, surrounded by boxes of faded letters and old newspaper clippings. At 90 years old, she is one of the last people who remembers that terrible Christmas Eve. Her fingers trace the edges of photographs, showing her 5 missing siblings. "I still dream about them sometimes," she whispers. Betty with her dark curls, Louis always making us laugh, Jenny taking care of everyone. For decades, Sylvia has shared her family's story with anyone who will listen. Reporters call her house. Documentary makers knock on her door. She answers every question the same way her parents did, with hope that someone, somewhere, knows what really happened. The internet has breathed new life into the Sodder case. Online forums buzz with theories. Amateur detectives study old photographs through computer screens. Social media posts about the missing children reach thousands of people around the world. Young people discover the story and become fascinated. They cannot believe 5 children could simply vanish without a trace. They share articles with friends. They debate the possibilities late into the night. Some believe the children died in the fire. Others are certain they were taken away to start new lives. A few think government secrets were involved. The mystery pulls people in because it feels so personal. Every family has children. Every parent fears losing them. Television shows have featured the Sodder story multiple times. Each new program brings fresh attention. Phone calls flood in from viewers who think they might have information. Most leads go nowhere, but Sylvia never stops hoping. People ask me why I keep talking about this after all these years. She says, "How could I not? They were my brothers and sisters. They deserve to be remembered." Modern technology offers new possibilities. DNA testing might identify remains. Computer programs can age old photographs to show what the children might look like today. These tools give surviving family members reason to continue searching. The billboard that once stood on Route 16 is gone now, but the questions it asked still echo through time. What happened to Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty Sodder? Were they taken that night? Did they grow up somewhere else with different names? Sylvia knows she may never get answers, but she also knows that as long as people remember her family's story, her siblings are not truly lost. Their mystery lives on, passed from one generation to the next, like a whispered secret that refuses to die.